So with the distress markers, we have some new colors of the markers that we released pre-show, which I know made a lot of people happy.
Very happy.
I know, very happy, because we had those. And in addition to working with these, I mean, what's nice about this is that you can use distress with a lot of different things. You can use distress by itself, or you can use distress with each other. All right. So I'm just going to show you just a couple of quick things of how I work with the markers.
And you really
And some
should
things
keep
that you
them
can
laying
do.
down like that.
You should store them horizontal only because it's a continuous ink barrel. So it's actually wicking both ends simultaneously. So if you store them one way or the other like this, gravity is just going to play a role and the nib is going to feel like it's dried out. But if you store them back, that'll re-wick. Some things, depending if you're going to work with this and for whatever reason you happen to color through a wet medium, like if you color through acrylic paint or something like that, and the fine tip starts to clog, you can just color on your finger and that's going to usually clean up that nib, which is helpful. Another thing about this, the markers themselves have dual nibs, so excuse me, when you work with them, I'm just going to grab a couple of different surfaces because you need to see different surfaces just so you can appreciate it. So we have specialty stamping paper. Now this is going to be a coated paper on both sides. We have Manilla, and of course we have watercolor cardstock. Now this watercolor cardstock is going to have a really nice texture on one side, a smooth finish on the other. And this is good especially if you're stamping, because if you want to stamp detail, you can stamp on that in color. But if you want to really go in and do a nice mixed media look, you can do that on the textured side.
That's the one you just released, the new one, the new paper?
So the watercolor cardstock 8.5 by 11, or the distress, it's the same thing. That's just pre-cut so it can go with the markers. So we just went in and we did a lot of research, obviously, on different things, but we know that usually a paper craft customer is not going to go down an art department aisle to buy a pad of watercolor paper. And plus, I really like the whole effect of having a very nice textured side, but also a perfectly smooth side.
The sizing's the same on both sides?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for blending, you've got no problem. Now, when you are blending, there's a couple of things to note, and this is where a lot of people don't realize this when it comes to distress markers. If I color on Manilla, I color on specialty stamping, and I color on watercolor, the blendability is going to be different. So if I went in with my water brush, let's take a detailer. If I go to blend on Manilla, it's really not going to give up much color. If I blend on specialty stamping, not going to give up much color. If I go on watercolor, this is going to give up the most color. And this is also going to give them just a little bit more playtime when it comes to coloring on those. So if you have customers that are experiencing some difficulty as far as blending their colors, just ask about different papers. But specialty is really cool. It's a great one to watercolor on, but it always dries with like this cloudy finish, which is kind of neat. Yeah, it almost does look kind of chalky, but I would say it almost creates even a white haze. So if I went in with a darker color, let's say I went in with Chip Sapphire, and I put that on, and I color that in, I mean, it's really going to be kind of wet when you blend it out, but when it dries, you're going to see it's going to create like this haze over the top of it, which I think is, I mean, I happen to like that look. So let's go in with just some little coloring tips that I've worked with. If I'm going to stamp with this, let's go in, I like the pumpkin. Let's do that. I'll stamp on the smooth side. I'm just going to go in with archival. Archival's a waterproof ink, so if we're going to stamp an image, we want to make sure that we're going to stamp with something permanent. Also, if you use mini stamps, one of the things I find working with a grid block, I prefer to put it on a longer grid block than the small grid block. I have pork chop fingers, so if I have a little tiny stamp and I'm trying to hold on to it, pick it up, it's not going to work. Whereas this, I'm able to hold the block from here, stamp and lift. So that's what I like to work with. Yes.
Oh, how did I get it?
Well, you're going to probably get some.
I still have it.
It's a badge of honor.
Now, can you stamp on the specialty paper too?
You can. Specialty stamping was actually designed specifically for that. So if you have like a detailed image.
It might smear.
No. Well, it's coated. I mean, you're going to have to dry it. It's not a clay coat because it's an interesting coat. We actually found it in Germany. It's a German paper, whereas gloss paper is a clay coated paper. So let's take one of your stickers. This is Brett. So for those of you that are familiar with this sketch on that I did, yeah, so this is the chemist, and then last time we did Time Travelers and Steampunk, that's the artist guy right there, Brett. So, yeah, this guy's super popular. He's the one that was on Frosted Film.
Yep. Okay.
I love it. Yeah, because it's kind of creepy looking. I do the creepiness of it. All right. So if we take that, let's just show on specialty stamping, and I'll even compare it to watercolor paper, just so you can see when you're stamping detail. Just let me make sure I get rid of all the glitter. All right, so I'm going to go in with archival. And I'm just going to tap it on there. Now, if you go and stamp on cardstock, this is watercolor paper. It's good. Stamp's really good. Still get good detail. Specialty stamping, though, was really designed specifically for stamping. So if you have photo images or images that have a lot of detail, like something like this that has a lot of sketch lines, it's going to transfer your image completely different.
And then what is the dry time if you don't actually dry it with your nose?
Probably about 3 minutes.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, because it's still a coated paper. So that's the big difference when it comes to working with the different papers, that if you want nice visual, and same thing, you could still go in and color both. What's nice about coloring on these papers is, of course, they're both going to blend. They're just going to blend a little different. So I'll normally go with a heat tool just to dry this ink. I don't need to dry it on that because it's going to soak in right away. Now, if you stamp with a different kind of ink, like if you stamp with, say, Stays On, that's going to be a little different.
See, I just hate using the stays on stuff.
I just don't like to use it. I don't like to work with a solvent. So if you were going to go and color with it, same thing, you could just color direct in watercolor, or you can work from a palette, either way. But like, for example, on a small image, normally when I work on a small image, I'm just going to go in and add some color. I'm not going to be too concerned by how much color I'm going to add at first. And then I'll go in with a water brush and just blend that out. I'm really not a great colorer, I'm more of a lazy colorer, but I make it work, and that works for me. That's all that matters. I dry in between layers, because I don't want the paper to peel apart. It doesn't take long for it to dry. Then I can go in, add a shadow if I want, still go back and blend that out. Go in and dry it, or you can blot it with a paper towel. Now if you want to introduce color, like if you want to introduce color and you don't want to dry it in between, you can always color on your craft sheet and pick up color that way. That's not going to be a problem. So if I wanted to, I can just scribble here and then pick up color, and I can introduce color onto a wet medium if I wanted to.
So what's going to scruff up the paper, in other words, is that pen tip?
No,
Oh,
too wet. The paper gets too wet,
I
it'll just start to peel apart. So whether it's the marker, whether it's even a water brush, just continuing to go over paper and wet it and wet it and wet it is going to create that effect where it's going to just start tearing it apart. So here I'm just going to add a little color there. Let's take some sort of green. That's going to work fine. Again, I'm just going to blend that out. Blend that out. If I wanted to create a shadow, I can go with frayed burlap on my craft sheet, pumice stone, anything like that.
and you make it look so easy.
You just don't think about it. Thinking is overrated. So
You're on the,
it is. Don't overthink the ink.
Don't overthink
So one of the
That's my
things
problem.
that I like to do when I'm coloring onto a stamped image and just give it a little bit more dimension, and I learned this from my friend Shell Fowler. She did a lot of the watercolor samples you see in the booth, because I look at her watercolor work and it's got so much detail to it. I'm like, how do you do all that great watercolor? She's like, oh, I just use the markers, water brush. I'm like, no, you got a secret. No, I don't. I'm like, okay, then you just color, I'll watch you. One of the things she does once she's done coloring the images, she's going to go back in with the distress marker, now going with the fine tip, and actually color on the image part. So right up against that line, and just by adding that little bit of color right on that line, it just starts to create this dimension. It just creates this little outline. And then if you still want to go in and just blend a little bit of it, you can. But it's just a great way to add a little bit more of that detail back into the image. It just gives it a completely different look. And this will just show you, like in true color, just that shadow in there. It's cool. Yeah, it's really simple. So if I'm going to do a background, pretend I cut it. A lot of times I'll go in with some distress ink, and I'll just pick up a little bit of it. I can go with my blending tool, and a lot of times I'll just add some ink there around the edge. Most of the time when people are coloring, they have a tendency to not really understand the background part of it. So I'll just go in with a water brush. I can wet it right on that torn edge. Normally I just have one torn edge there. But I can also go in with a flat brush. So the flat water brush is going to allow me to take that, and I can pull that color in from what I just blended and just create that background color without overthinking it. Because if you know color, great, but like I said, I don't. So I know that I can take my inked edge and I can just do a background like that, and I don't have to worry about re-wetting all of that. That's just, I said, it makes you look like you know what you're doing, which I do not. And then I'm just going to dry it.